Folks, the first Baltimore police officer to go on trial in the death of Freddie Gray will have to return to court for another trial.
All night, all day, we gon' fight for Freddie Gray. All night, all day, we gon' fight for Freddie Gray.
Protesters took to the streets as soon as the judge declared a mistrial for Officer William Porter. The 26-year-old is one of the 6 officers charged in the April death of Freddie Gray, a 25-year-old black man who died after his spine was severed while he was in custody in the back of a police transport van. Mass protests broke out late in April following Gray's death and funeral. Yesterday, Gray's family begged the public to protest peacefully and respect the legal process.
Not at all upset with them, and neither should the public be upset. They did the best that they could. We are hopeful that Ms. Mosley will retry Officer Porter as soon as possible, and that his next jury will reach a verdict. Once again, we ask the public to remain calm, patient, because we are confident there will be another trial with a different jury. We are calm. You should be calm too.
The fact that a hard-working jury representing the citizens of Baltimore, and indeed a cross-section of the citizens of Baltimore, couldn't reach a verdict says nothing about whether a verdict can be reached in a second trial, nor does it say anything about whether a verdict can be reached for any of the other officers. Each officer has his own trial. Each officer's evidence is going to be different, and we can't predict what a jury is going to do based on a hung jury. We just can't do it.
When you think about justice, justice is not simply a result. You know, we talk about due process. It is a process. And so we entrust to 12 men and women chosen from the voters list of Baltimore City to make a judgment.
We will not and cannot be defined by the unrest of last spring. As a city, as a community, we are stronger, and we are united to be better than what some displayed to the world in the spring.
The defense team for Porter is scheduled to meet with the judge in the case today. Joining us to talk about this case, Baltimore activist Davon Love with Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, Charles Robinson III, Maryland Public Television reporter. Also joining us via Skype in Dallas is Yodit Tewolde, criminal defense attorney. Also joining us on the panel, Monique Presley with the Presley Law Firm, A. Scott Bolden, partner at Reed Smith, Angela Peoples, co-director at Get Equal. I want to first start with you, Charles. This trial went on for several days. You saw the testimony. This was supposed to be the strongest case, if you will. Prosecutors wanted to come out of the box to get a conviction. Clearly, this is troubling for the DA's office.
Part of the problem here was it was a high level of what we would call, how do we get to the end of this case? They had testimony already from Officer Porter in a deposition he gave following an internal investigation. But then he took the stand in his own defense. There were conflicting statements that he made. In the actual process, this is what the jurors had to deal with, whether or not he was truthful on the stand. But the bigger issue was this whole idea of, why didn't he belt in Freddie Gray? Because both the medical examiner and the defense's expert said, had he been belted in, Freddie Gray would still be alive.
Yodit, first of all, you were tweeting this issue. You said this was a weak case from the start.
Absolutely. When you have multiple defendants who are going to be tried separately, the state wants to prosecute its strongest case because at that point, it may create a domino effect. Because at that point, some of the other officers may opt out of trying the case and may cop a plea deal. That was not the case here. In fact, this case was weak and very difficult to prove from the outset. So the fact that these attorneys are going to meet today to set the trial for trial number 2, I'm presuming that they're going to retry this case. And I think that that's a bad idea. I think that they shouldn't retry Officer Porter for a number of reasons. One, the prosecution is already at a disadvantage. They've already shown the defense attorneys what their trial strategy is. The defense attorneys now know what hand they're playing. And so all they're going to do is toughen up the defense. The other reason is it's going to be difficult for the state to pick 12 new jurors who may not be affected by the first trial's outcome. So if they need Officer Porter's testimony against Officer Goodson, who's the one that's actually charged with the most serious crime of second-degree murder with depraved heart, then what they need to do is offer Officer Porter immunity in exchange for his testimony, and that should have been done before, at the very beginning, because he didn't have the most serious offense to begin with.
Hey, Scott Bolden, your assessment, do you agree with Yodit or disagree?
Well, those are issues, but those are issues in the first trial and every trial across this country. The fact of the matter is that the prosecution does need Porter. They probably have offered him a deal. He turned it down. Look for them to offer him another deal because they need him, because in this first trial, he pointed the finger at Goodson and he pointed the finger at Alicia White, two supervisors who he indicated that Freddie Gray needed a medic or they needed to go to the hospital. Neither one of those supervisors did that. And so I think the real issue here is whether they tried Porter first, right out of the box, and move the other trials back of the co-defendants, or whether Judge Williams says, you had your shot, so let's start with Goodson. There's going to be a lot of negotiation because the prosecution and the defense are meeting with the judge this morning.
Monique, your assessment.
I agree with Scott. You don't really know what's going on behind closed doors. I suspect that he's right, that they did try to start out with a deal and that the deal did not work out before they even went to trial. But also, you never really know what's in the mind of the lead prosecutor and what they're really trying to do. They now have two separate statements from this officer. They have sworn testimony under oath where he's pointing the finger at suspects who they really want to get. So even though they risked losing the first time and they risk public opinion going against them, I commend the prosecutor's office for trying to get a conviction every place they can. And if we just let them do their jobs and, you know, throw some encouragement down the road, because we're the ones who are always saying, charge the officers, and now when it doesn't work out, we're saying they should have taken a deal, we want them to play it smart. I think we really have to decide who we are, what we want, and back up the play of the people who are on the ground and let them do their job. So I'm thinking that today there will be some negotiating, and then we'll see. If it comes out on their side, then all the trials will get backed up. If it doesn't, they don't necessarily lose. They've got sworn testimony they can use. They can cut a deal later. They can call him and let him take fifth on the stand. We'll see what happens. It'll be interesting to watch.
Davon, 8 black jurors, 4 white jurors, 7 men, 5 women. And so the fact that they could not come to a unanimous decision on even the lowest level charge, your perspective from activists there on the ground in Baltimore.
Well, I mean, I would say two things. The first is to put it in broader context. I mean, the fact that there even needs to be a trial just demonstrates a fundamental injustice in the very system of police, of law enforcement in general. There should be internal apparatus that address the issue of protecting the public. But on to the specific trial, I mean, one of the things that's important to keep in mind, many activists were involved in trying to go to Annapolis during the General Assembly and reform the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. And it's important to note that the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights provides certain protections that actually give the defense certain strategic advantages. For instance, officers have 10 days before they're required to make a statement on the record. So this gives them time to be able to come up with a story. And as one of the folks at my organization had someone in the courtroom who said that there were instances where there were inconsistencies in the story that was told by Porter, and they documented the ways in which the story was different throughout those 10 days. The other piece is that the interrogation of the police officer. So one of the things that happened during the trial's interrogation of the medical examiner, and medical examiners don't have the same access to police officers in the case of excessive force as a result of the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. So from the activist side, for us, it's very important to continue to push these legislative reforms so that it can provide the prosecution the tools that it needs to be able to more effectively try these cases when they happen.
Angela Peoples, when we talk about these particular cases, I think what it also shows us, we saw in the case in Delaware, where the gentleman was going, the African-American man was going to the ground, the officer kicked him in the head, knocked him out unconscious, a jury found him not guilty. This also shows us the difficulty across this country that juries have with finding cops guilty of conduct. It's very rare for a cop to be found guilty.
Absolutely, and I think that that's actually a point that's very much worth noting in this conversation. A lot of what the reports are saying is talking about sort of Officer Porter did, what was reasonable. We heard that also in conversations when we were talking about Tamir Rice in that case, or when we're talking about in the case of Mike Brown's shooting. We talk about sort of this reasonable assumption that officers are given, they only have to do so much. They only have to take so many steps to protect life, to do their job that they were sworn to do. So there's just sort of assumption of benevolence, right? And that police officers are not only exempt from a lot of laws, but they're also the standard that we're holding them to when it comes to whether or not they violated not even just the law, but their own, internal policies is very, very low. And I think that says a lot about how we view our community versus how we give credence to the police, who are really just protecting the state and lots of properties.
Charles, what are you hearing? What's next?
Well, first and foremost, that this hearing is going to take place. It was going to be done in open court. Now it's going to be done in the judges' chambers. One of the things that I think a lot of people are missing in this whole case is that you had to have a unanimous verdict. You had to have all 12 on board. Let me just tell you, it was 8 to 4, black versus white, and there have been suggestions that some of the white jurors were not going to find this police officer guilty. And so when we go through the next phase, we'll go through this whole jury selection process. They went through 150 jurors just to get 12. We'll probably go through the same process again. And they're already talking about moving this from outside of Baltimore. But Attorney Billy Murphy was very clear. He said, we've already proven that we can do a case here in the city of Baltimore.
I think that the mayor and the prosecutor really need to be concerned about what the confidence and the faith of the community throughout the rest of these trials that are going to have to take place. I want to commend the leaders of a Beautiful Struggle and Baltimore Block for continuing to do the organizing to push beyond what we know is going to be, whether or not what happens with this trial and the rest of the subsequent trials. We know that there's much more work to do, but I think that the leaders in Baltimore really need to take a step to think about what they're going to do in addition to this trial, to really think about how to restore the community's trust in this process.
Yeah, that's true, but
Can I chime in?
I'm sorry, Roland, but the reality is this trial is not going to get moved. Baltimore has demonstrated that they can do it. You're going to have the same issues if you move it to Calvert County or if you move it to Chicago, Illinois. People bring their prejudices, they bring their culture to the table. The real problem with this case is that you don't have any eyewitnesses. One is dead and the other one only had a small view of Freddie Gray, and so it's a circumstantial case, and you're trying to prove criminal negligence. That's a huge standard to prove right here, and so it's going to be tough to pick a fair and impartial juror, but it's also going to be tough no matter what to get a unanimous verdict. And so I've done mock trials on this very issue, on this very case, and you want to know what? The audience was split 50-50 after an oral argument and a closing argument just based on public information. It's going to be tough no matter where you do it.
So Scott, you said you've done mock trials. You've done mock trials on this.
On Freddie Gray.
And it was 50-50?
It was 50-50. The mock trial was an opening and a closing based on the public information that we had on Freddie Gray. It was at Reed Temple Church. And I must tell you this, the audience was 50-50. You know what they said? When I walked in this sanctuary, I knew that these police officers were guilty of killing Freddie Gray. At the end of the presentation by a Maryland attorney and myself, the audience was 50-50 on whether these officers were guilty or not. And and it just played out in real life in this courtroom, and it's going to play out again. Now, maybe you can get 12 in one place going in the same direction, maybe not, and maybe that is justice. Maybe the civil justice system and the $6 or $5 million that were paid to the family, maybe that's the real justice in this case. We'll have to see.
Yodit, go ahead.
I don't understand how people can make the argument that these officers can receive a fair trial in the city of Baltimore, yet make I think it's unfair to assume that these white jurors were the ones that refused to convict Officer Porter, because we don't know what the numerical divide of this jury was at all. first and foremost, when a defendant is facing criminal charges, the state has a very high burden beyond a reasonable doubt, and they got to prove each and every element of the crime charged. Now, on top of that, when you have the defendant as an officer, then that's an added burden for that prosecution. Not to mention that we've already had problems to indict officers. So imagine how hard it's going to be to convict. Now, we've talked about wanting swift action. We've gotten that. Marilyn Mosby made an announcement that her office was going to indict these 6 officers less than 2 weeks after Freddie Gray died. We asked for a DA who's going to be fair and who's going to consider justice for a young black man. We got that, Marilyn Mosby. We asked the judge to consider keeping these cases in the city of Baltimore, not to have them moved, and he did that. Then we asked for a fair and impartial jury, one that's made up of the community, that's representative of the community. We get 8 black jurors and 4 white jurors, but yet Officer Porter still wasn't convicted. Now, my concern is what people are concerned about with this legal system. I get the frustration that people have. They feel that the system isn't here for us. And of course, it's not perfect. It needs reform. But my concern is that we felt that the system failed us yesterday because we didn't get a conviction, but the justice system is required to also find those who aren't guilty of certain crimes. So
Gotcha.
we have to realize, we have to also, Roland, you gotta let me finish this. We have to realize.
You got about 10 seconds.
We have to realize that getting justice for Freddie Gray and his family may mean that we don't get convictions for all 6 of these officers, unfortunately.
Folks, we are out of time. I certainly appreciate it. Charles Robinson, thank you so very much. Davon Love, thanks a bunch. Yodit Tewolde, thank you very much as well.